Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Louisa. If you're new, don't forget to subscribe, and if you're coming back, welcome back. As you probably noticed, I'm in a slightly different setting. Things are a bit up in the air at the moment. I'm in the process of moving house. I've also finished uni for the undergraduate and I'm just waiting on my final results. And yeah, so it's a weird transition period. I am hopefully going to get into honors and I'm getting married in like 2 weeks. So there's a lot going on, but since I don't have assignments, I actually have some time to make videos. One of my final courses that I did at uni was actually an elective. So it wasn't actually part of the psychology degree, but it was just one that I thought could be interesting. It was a communications elective and it was on intercultural communication. And one of the challenges that we had was to go onto social media and to find someone that we don't necessarily agree with or would ordinarily refuse to follow them, and sort of, you know, it's an exercise in getting out of your echo chamber and to go onto social media to follow this person and to find something in their posts to like. So for my challenge, I decided to go with Girl Defined, which might seem a little bit weird considering that I am a Christian influencer, but yeah, I don't agree with a lot of stuff that they say. I agree with some of their stuff because, like, obviously they base a lot of their advice on stuff that's written in the Bible, and I believe the Bible. I don't necessarily believe what other people try to claim that the Bible says, especially on things like, you know, the prosperity gospel, the extremes of purity culture. I mean, there is a general call to holiness. If you are dedicated to Christ, you are supposed to live a life that is reflective of that. So like, some of it I agree with, some of it I think is just way beyond the bounds of what scripture actually talks about and is extremely damaging and extremely toxic. So I did the obligatory follow and like one of their posts, but almost immediately I found a post that was a bit of an issue, which is this one. So obviously it was a slideshow of different slides, and ordinarily I would include like all of them if they were relevant, but it's really just this one slide that I wanted to talk about because the rest of it wasn't really relevant to this conversation that I'm wanting to have today. So it says, in most, if not all, cases, pornography use is the symptom of a much deeper sin. That deeper sin can vary. It can be things like bitterness, anger, anxiety, depression, or idolatry. But for all of them, porn is an escape, a coping mechanism, and it puts men and women on a dangerous cycle of sinful behavior. So this is an example of where Girl Defined goes into territory that they are not qualified to talk about, such as the mental health field. As far as I know, they don't have any qualifications in counseling or psychology or social work or anything related to mental health, and they don't have any practical skills in that department as far as I can tell. So in terms of like education, practical skills, qualifications, anything like that, they don't really seem to have that basis themselves. They've interviewed a bunch of people on the subject who may or may not be qualified as experts, but they're certainly presented as experts. And it seems like a lot of the advice that they give and a lot of the experts that they get are very much in the same vein of the purity culture movement, which we've spoken about before on this channel. It has a very checkered past and it was probably more of a recent American phenomenon than one that has been widely accepted by the church for thousands of years. And in terms of what purity culture and what the prosperity gospel and things like that have to say about mental health, well, that's also pretty, it's a mixed bag. And this isn't just to pick on, Christian influencers, because influencers in general on social media talk a lot about mental health, and sometimes they do things like this where they wander into territory where they don't really know what the research supports, what is accurate and what is not accurate, what are the conflicting findings, which sometimes add a bit of nuance to the conversation. And influencers in general will talk about things that they're not really qualified to talk about, but they try to impose their own experiences and their own worldview onto other people, which is a tendency that I think we all have. And it's fine to talk openly on social media about your experiences and to share what you have experienced and what you have learned from those experiences. But to make generalizations about other people is pretty risky. So the positive aspect is talking about mental health and destigmatizing these conversations about issues that people have and struggles that they have. And then on the flip side, trying to apply a very narrow perspective onto everyone and assuming that that's going to be helpful to people, but people's situations are all very different. So labeling other people's mental health struggles as a sin, super risky, super dangerous to other people's well-being, and not something that I would ever condone. It has the potential to be extremely harmful to people when they are in a very vulnerable situation. So just to be clear, because this particular post is all about pornography, and I don't particularly condone pornography. I think it's a harmful industry that has ruined people's lives, and when you hear interviews from people who have been in the porn industry and the amount of drug abuse, substance abuse that happens, the amount of mental health struggles that go on, the rates of depression and suicide. There's a pastor who used to be a porn star. He did over 1,000 films for about 6 years. And he says that in the time that he was in the industry, he knew 35 people who took their own lives. And these are the people who are willingly in the industry. Like, that's not even talking about the people who are not willing and who have been coerced into it. There's a lot of human trafficking that goes on, and young women in particular who try to migrate to different countries to get better opportunities. And when they get there, someone takes their passport, essentially imprisons them and forces them to work in this industry. And the end consumer has no idea what sort of situation they're actually watching. But aside from the detrimental way that the industry treats people and the health outcomes for the people in the industry, let's not even get into the STIs and how bad that can be. But there's also the issue of when you are consuming a product like this, it teaches you to dehumanize and to sexually objectify other people in a way that is very unhealthy for your relationships. If we want to talk about sin, then I think Jesus summed it up very succinctly in Matthew chapter 5. You have heard that it was said to those of old, "You shall not commit adultery." But I say to you that whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and cast it from you. For it is more profitable for you that one of your members perish than for your whole body to be cast into hell. The preacher Tim Mackey, technically he's a doctor, doctor of ancient Hebrew, he describes that particular passage as, you know, similar to the whole watching porn thing, where you look at another person, say on the street, or maybe it's someone you know, and you start playing that fantasy in your head and incorporating that person into your own mind to objectify them, to turn them into a sexual object, and to dehumanize them. Essentially, like, you're not getting their consent to fantasize about them in a way which might make them absolutely horrified and uncomfortable if they were to find out that you did that. And so to place another human being into that situation is kind of creepy, kind of gross, and it's just exploitative of other people. And it teaches us to view other people in terms of like how they can serve us instead of how we can be helpful to them. So on a personal level, I am 100% against the porn industry, and I think that it's good that influencers talk about it, because I don't think it's healthy for anyone. I don't think it's healthy for the people who produce it and who star in it. I don't think it's healthy for the people who watch it and who use it. And I would encourage anyone and everyone to stop supporting that kind of industry. So sure, I'm 100% behind Girl Defined doing posts about this stuff and having that conversation with people about how to actually love your neighbor and how to be, you know, caring towards others without being exploitative towards others, and how to be respectful to yourself as well. But they weren't just on that topic. They weren't just having that conversation. They were bringing all of these other things into it and claiming that, like, if you have a problem with pornography, then it's because you have sinned by being depressed or anxious. And it's like, where are you getting these connections from? Because it's not supported by any kind of research. I can't think of any Bible passages that would fit this scenario. Like, you're just making this stuff up right now, and it's really, really dangerous. So they said that, you know, pornography use is because of much deeper sin, and the sins are things like bitterness, anger, anxiety, depression, or idolatry. Maybe. And porn is an escape and a coping mechanism. So sure, like porn and food and substances and going to the gym and working out, all of these things can be escapism. You know, being chronically online, you can become addicted to almost anything. You can become addicted to things that are technically good for you in the way that, like, you relate to those things. If you start to use something as an emotional crutch and you don't feel like you can cope without it, then that's an issue. As Christians, we are supposed to lean upon the Lord. So he's essentially supposed to be our emotional crutch. So checking out and avoiding, you know, life, avoiding things that you need to take responsibility for, avoiding reality because it's too difficult or you're unable to cope, these can all be serious issues and could constitute sin. But the underlying emotional void or emotional issues that are driving you to do these things, those aren't sin. Feeling lonely or feeling isolated, feeling depressed, feeling anxious, feeling overwhelmed, even feeling angry, like, that's not a sin. I mean, the Bible verse that comes to mind is, be angry and do not sin. So it's not saying don't sin by being angry. It's saying, yeah, be angry, but choose how you're going to respond to that emotion. Like, you can have emotions and then choose how to respond to those emotions. A lot of the time, emotions are just symptoms about, what's going on environmentally, how your relationships are going, and perhaps some mindsets that you've got which might be causing some issues. Mm-hmm. And this is Willow. This is Tom's puppy. Hello. I highly recommend dogs if you're feeling depressed. So the thing about different emotions and different mood states like anxiety and depression is that they have a variety of different underlying causes. So Girl Defined is like, the underlying cause of pornography use is these emotional and mood states. And it's not really talking about like what is causing the emotional and mood states. So there are like situations where depression and anxiety can actually be a symptom of some issues with the person which could be considered sin. For example, there is such a thing as narcissistic depression. And this is a type of depression that afflicts people with narcissistic personalities. So that happens when someone essentially has a hyperinflated ego and they believe that they are amazing and should be recognized for all of these incredible achievements or just the general amazingness of who they are. They don't necessarily achieve very much. They just believe that they are so amazing as a person that everyone should recognize it. And what happens when it's not recognized? What happens when reality sets in and reality is not reflecting back to them the delusion and the fantasy that they live in? So what happens is those people actually fall into a depression. And so, it can kind of be rooted in sin occasionally. But that's only if you have like a personality disorder. As I said, there's an enormous variety of causes of depression. There's also chemical issues that go on. So for example, bipolar. Bipolar 1 and bipolar 2 are both characterized by depression. And so whether it's bipolar 1 or bipolar 2, both of them are characterized by depressive states. And where bipolar 2 is mostly depression, bipolar 1 is also, that's why it's called bipolar, is because you go from the manic state to the depressive state. And that is almost 100% a chemical issue. So that's known to be a chemical form of depression, and they know that because it responds to chemical treatment. Not every form of depression will respond to drug treatment, so it just varies. It varies on what is causing the depression, because depression essentially is more like a symptom than an actual condition. It is diagnosable as a disorder on its own, major depressive disorder, but it tends to be caused by something. So depression does have physiological causes in some cases, not every case. Oftentimes, so there's sort of three main causes of depression. There's physiological issues, chemical and brain structural problems. Then there is the actual mindset of the person. So if someone has a very self-focused, they don't really see out beyond themselves and their own issues, and they get very myopic about their own lives, and everything is blown way out of proportion. So, that can happen. And again, like narcissistic depression is an issue. So some of it could be like mindset, but then there's also environmental influences that can cause depression. So people can become depressed because they are being abused and they don't have any way of escaping the environment where they are not feeling safe and they are constantly being under attack. So the idea that like depression is a sin is not backed up by the Bible at all, because the entire 42 chapters of Job are an example of how, you know, someone can fall into a depression because of circumstances, and they're not in those circumstances because they sinned. Like, they're not the sinner. That's just life. Like, life is hard. And life being hard is not, you know, evidence that God doesn't love you, because that's the kind of false doctrine that you get in the prosperity gospel. So Christians can very much be struggling with mental health issues, and that's not, you know, them sinning. There's also 150 psalms, which are an emotional roller coaster through, you know, anger and anxiety and bitterness and depression, states of despair. And at the end of them, of course, they tend to end on a hopeful note that the Lord will follow through and help them out of their difficulties or help them through their difficulties. But it's not denial of their difficulties. It's not saying, oh, well, I shouldn't feel any type of way. I don't have any feelings because I'm a robot. No, it's very much acknowledging that things suck. So is anxiety a sin? Well, there are a lot of Bible passages that tell people not to worry and to have faith in God. But it doesn't necessarily say that you're not going to feel anxious at any point in time. A lack of faith in God is pretty much a sin, but that's only one potential cause of anxiety. Anxiety, like depression, can have a number of different causes, and sometimes it's because people have this sense that they have control, or that they need to have control of everything, including things that are completely outside of their control and which are completely in God's hands. And that's when you get into territory like witchcraft, which was my background before I was saved. And witchcraft has this mindset of, it's very actually similar to OCD, where, you know, you worry about these things like, oh, my dog might die, so I better light a candle under the full moon and bathe 3 times in Mountain Dew, because that'll stop my dog from dying. And like, those things are completely unrelated. But unfortunately, that's what witchcraft teaches, is it teaches that, you know, human beings have control over these things that they don't have control over. And in OCD as well, which I have found, I mean, research has found that OCD can have a lot of very religious undertones to it, where people become obsessive about prayer because they think that if they stop praying, disaster is imminent and things like that. So these sorts of mindsets can give you a mental health problem. They can give you a disorder because you think that you can control your thoughts and your emotions and all of these things. And the more you try to control that stuff, the more fixated you become on it, the more paranoid you are about it, then you can develop things like obsessive compulsive disorder. So the sort of mental health advice that Girl Defined is giving to people is not just potentially very damaging to people's mental health. It can actually also seriously affect your relationship with God, because it turns into this paranoid, anxious, chore where you're constantly monitoring your thoughts and your feelings, expecting that your thoughts and feelings are sinful. And really, like, everyone has intrusive thoughts. Those are totally normal. They're essentially like brain farts. And they might have, in some cases, a spiritual component to them. But they're just thoughts. Like, you aren't necessarily taking them on board. They're just random ideas, and you can go, that was weird, and move on. It's when people place so much emphasis on their own thoughts and on their own, feelings, that they become very obsessed about them, which in turn can lead to anxiety. So people can develop anxiety from trying to control anxiety. So while there might be, causes of anxiety which are to do with trying to control everything and trying to, essentially go into the realm of God instead of just giving things to God and saying, you know what, this sucks. I need help. I am struggling. I don't feel good. Lord, just comfort me. So anxiety can develop from that kind of mindset, but anxiety can also develop from being systematically, long-term, tortured and abused for years and years, and your nervous system is essentially destroyed. So abuse victims have a lot of anxiety because they have been so used to living in a hypervigilant state, so used to being just randomly attacked for no particular reason, and they're just a bundle of nerves, and there's nothing they can do about that. It's not something that they are causing, it's something that's happening to them. So, for example, when I lived with my abusive ex-husband, and he would essentially prey on me in the house. He would be aware of what I was doing, whether it was like housework or in the kitchen or something, and he would wait until my hands were full, until my back was turned, or until I was bending down to do something, and then he would creep up behind me and violate my private areas. So over the years of that happening, of course I became hypervigilant. I had to constantly listen out for his whereabouts in the house so that I could empty my hands, turn around, get something solid behind me, and get ready to fend him off. So after 3 years of this, I had massive amounts of anxiety, and I actually didn't even know that that was happening to me until I went on a family holiday. And when my dad touched me on the shoulder, I just flinched. I flinched every time someone came near me. I flinched every time someone just, touched me in a very normal way, in ways that I would never have reacted like that beforehand. So my nervous system was a complete wreck from years of abuse. And I was being gaslit by my abuser to tell me that this was my issue, that I had, problems with being romantic. And if I had have gone to someone like Girl Defined in that moment, looking for support, looking for advice, looking for help, what kind of advice would I have received from someone like Bethany? They're telling people who they don't know that being anxious or being depressed is a sin. And that person might be going through absolute hell. So these people who are trying to be helpful are essentially gaslighting, potentially, a bunch of victims, and victim blaming people who have lived with abuse for years. What are they actually doing to people? There are very serious implications for how this sort of thing actually affects people's lives. But these influencers don't think about that. That it's completely outside of their awareness. They don't have the training, they don't have the qualifications, they don't have any personal experience with this stuff in order to relate to it or to even consider that it is a possibility. They are completely unqualified to talk about this stuff, and yet they are telling people that they must stop being anxious, stop being depressed. Oh, okay, so you're being sexually assaulted every day for years on end. Well, you're a sinner. There's no acknowledgement that people might be living with something that they shouldn't be living with, and that they might need help, and that they might need to get away from that. Like, what? And so people might not be necessarily going to their channel for advice on how to stop watching porn, because that was not an issue that I had or have. But people follow them who are looking for advice on relationships and are looking for advice on how to be Christians and how to live a godly life, and they're getting this advice. And it's just so irresponsible and absolutely boggles my mind that people are allowed to do this. This is what we are entitled to do. We are entitled to talk about whatever we want and to pretend like we know what we're talking about. And, you know, no one can really hold you to account. And I saw stuff like that all the time in like the New Age community. And, you know, you would have influencers and authors and people like, you know, Medical Medium, who recently one of his followers died from cancer because she shunned treatment. And there's no repercussions for the people who put the ideas in other people's heads that they should shun medical treatment because they can just believe themselves well. You know, sometimes people actually need real help. Sometimes people really need medication. Sometimes people really need therapy. Sometimes people really need trauma therapy. So if you are struggling with any mental health problems, I would definitely advise you not to follow people like Girl Defined, because their advice is very unqualified and it's very simplistic, and they just don't have a nuanced worldview in general. And if you are struggling with this stuff, you know, reach out to different organizations for help. Sometimes Christian organizations are helpful, sometimes they're not. But Christians should not be afraid of seeking therapy, because, you know, these people do predominantly know what they're talking about. Sometimes they have their own lenses, like they'll try to push meditation onto you. There's a lot of research into meditation that it's not necessarily any better than a Band-Aid solution. And, you know, all of these Eastern practices and stuff, they can be a stopgap, but they're not necessarily going to fix your problems. And if you are a Christian, they might not be faithful to God. So be discerning about the type of mental health advice that you get. It's fine to listen to different perspectives and to glean the nuggets of truth that are in them, but to ultimately just try and use good sound logic and as much research as you can to figure out, you know, what your situation is, what is appropriate for you, what is not appropriate for you. And yeah, don't take on board things that other people think about your mental health situation if they are not qualified to know about your mental health situation. Alright guys, thanks so much for watching. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button, and I'll see you next time. Bye.